When the ground stopped shaking, I finally did too. I am a social worker. I have spent my entire professional life studying the architecture of broken families, learning to read the warning signs, tracing the fault lines before they split open and swallow someone whole. I know what dysfunction looks like from the outside. I know what it sounds like in a case file. I know the language of neglect and the grammar of emotional abandonment better than most people know their native tongue. And yet, for the longest time, I could not read my own story clearly. I was too close to it, too deeply embedded in the patterns I had been raised inside, too practiced at making myself small and calling it survival. It took an earthquake, a literal shaking of the ground beneath my feet, to finally make me see what had been true all along. The earthquake came without warning, the way they always do. There was no cinematic buildup, no distant rumble growing louder, no time to brace yourself in a doorframe the way they teach you in school. It was just a sudden, violent jolt, the kind that grabs the whole world and shakes it like something disposable. The walls shuddered. The cupboards flew open. I heard the sound of plates hitting the floor and shattering, that particular sharp crack that means something is done, finished, irreparable. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. In the silence that followed, I found my daughter Ruby standing in the doorway of her bedroom. She was 5 years old and small for her age, the kind of small that makes strangers want to protect her on instinct, and she was clutching her stuffed fox tightly against her chest with both arms, as if she believed that a toy animal could somehow hold the shaking world together. Her eyes were wide and dark and searching, and when she found my face across the room, she whispered one word, "Mommy," just that. Just my name in her child's voice, soft and uncertain, asking the question that all children ask in terrifying moments. "Are you here, and is everything going to be okay?" I told her it was okay. I said it the way parents say things they are not sure are true, with a calm and steady voice that is really just a shell built around fear. I held her and I stroked her hair and I repeated it until she stopped shaking. It was okay. It was over. We were fine. By the following morning, a city building inspector arrived at my door. He was wearing a hard hat and carrying a clipboard, and he had the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen this particular kind of destruction many times before, and had long since stopped being moved by it. He walked through my house, checked the foundation, looked at the walls, noted the cracks that had appeared overnight in places I hadn't even thought to look. Then he took a red sticker from his clipboard and pressed it onto my front door, and told me, in the tone of someone delivering routine information, that the property had been declared unlivable. He recommended I arrange alternative housing immediately. Then he walked back to his vehicle, climbed in, and drove away to the next house on his list. I stood on my porch with Ruby's hand in mine, and I looked at that red sticker on my door and I thought, with the particular clarity that catastrophe sometimes produces, that I had no plan. I had savings, yes, and I had a job, and I had a car and a suitcase and whatever we could pack in the next few hours, but I had no clear answer to the most basic question. Where were we going to sleep tonight, and tomorrow night, and the night after that? The answer that came to me felt like the most natural thing in the world. I would call my parents. My mother and father still lived in the same house where I had grown up, 5 hours away by car. It was a big house, a house with spare bedrooms and a basement and a den and a yard, a house that had been home to me for the first 17 years of my life. My older sister Brittany was staying there too, along with her boyfriend Shane and her 3 children from her first marriage. It was a full house, certainly, but it was family. And in a crisis, family steps forward. That was what I had always been told. That was what I still, despite everything I knew professionally and everything I had experienced personally, still believed in some stubborn, hopeful corner of myself. I dialed my mother's number. She answered on the second ring and her voice was warm and immediate, and she said, "Of course, honey, come home," and those words hit me like something I had been waiting years to hear. I nearly cried with relief right there on the porch. I thanked her and told her we would be there by evening, and I went inside to pack. I did not, in that moment of relief and urgency, think to ask whether you can come included my 5-year-old daughter. It did not occur to me that this needed to be clarified. It did not enter my mind as a question that a reasonable person would need to ask, because the idea that my mother might have been inviting me without my child was so far outside the boundaries of what I understood a family to be that my brain simply did not generate it as a possibility. I was a mother. Ruby was my daughter. We came together. This was not complicated. I packed us both quickly, efficiently, the way social workers learn to pack, the way people pack when they have handled emergencies before and know that speed matters more than completeness. Clothes, toothbrushes, Ruby's stuffed fox, a bag of snacks for the road. I buckled Ruby into her car seat and she asked me with the direct simplicity of a 5-year-old whether our house was really broken. I said yes. She asked whether Grandma's house was big. I said big enough. She seemed to accept this and settled back against her seat, and we drove. It was nearly sunset when I pulled into my parents' driveway. The porch light was on, the way it always was when I came home for visits, and for a moment the sight of it produced in me a wave of feeling so strong that I had to grip the steering wheel and breathe through it. Safety. That was what that light meant to me. It was a symbol I had carried since childhood, a small, reliable signal that someone was home, that someone was expecting you, that you were welcome. I had not felt genuinely welcome in that house in a very long time, but the light still meant what it had always meant to the child I used to be, and for one brief, suspended moment, standing at the start of that driveway with the evening light fading behind me, I let myself feel it. My mother opened the front door before I could knock. She said my name with a warmth that sounded genuine, and then her eyes moved past me to Ruby and her smile changed. It didn't disappear exactly, but something behind it shifted, contracted slightly, the way a light dims when the voltage drops. She said, "Oh, you brought her." Just those 4 words, in a tone that was not quite unwelcome, but was not quite welcome either, the tone of someone who has just encountered a complication they hadn't planned for. I waited for the joke. I waited for her to laugh and say of course she had brought her. What was she thinking? Come in, come in. The joke didn't come. My mother stood in the doorway and looked at me with an expression that was patient and apologetic and entirely unashamed, and she explained that she had thought it would just be me. The house was full. Brittany was here with her 3 children. Shane was using the den as a workspace. The basement had been converted into a game room. There was nowhere to put another child. Ruby, who had been half hidden behind my leg this entire time, listening to the conversation with the careful attention that children pay to adult conversations about them, spoke up in a small voice. She said she could sleep on the couch. She said it with such quiet dignity and such complete willingness to make herself as unobtrusive as possible that something in my chest tightened painfully. My 5-year-old daughter, who had just survived an earthquake and spent the last 24 hours being brave and adaptable and uncomplaining, was offering to sleep on a couch in order to make it easier for the adults in the room. My mother smiled at her the way people smile at animals that do something unexpectedly charming, fondly, but without real engagement, and said that it was not about being good, that it was just a full house. From somewhere inside the house, I could hear laughter and the sound of video games, the comfortable noise of people settled in and at ease in their space. My sister Brittany appeared, her phone in hand, her hair perfect, offering a sympathetic smile and a casual confirmation that there were no available beds. Not for another child, anyway. And then my mother said it, with the reasonable tone of someone proposing an obvious and sensible solution. She suggested that Ruby might stay somewhere else, just for a few nights, just until things settled. She said it the way you might suggest leaving your coat in the car because the restaurant was crowded. As if my daughter were a piece of luggage rather than a person. As if separating a 5-year-old from her mother in the aftermath of a natural disaster were a perfectly normal and logistically straightforward arrangement. Without the child, those were her words, without the child. Ruby heard them. She was standing right there, her hand tightening on the fabric of my coat, her small face doing the complicated work of a child, trying to understand why the people who were supposed to love her were suggesting that she be sent somewhere else. Her eyes went red. I watched her process it, watched her try to find a way to make it make sense, and I watched the tears start before she could stop them. She was crying quietly, the way children cry when they are trying not to be a burden, when they have already absorbed the message that their feelings are inconvenient. I looked at my mother for a long moment. I looked at Brittany. I looked at the warm, lit, full house behind them, and I understood something with a clarity that felt like cold water. This was not a miscommunication. This was not a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with a conversation. This was simply what my family had always been, and I had spent years rearranging my memory to make it look like something kinder. I zipped Ruby's coat. I took her hand. I told her we were going somewhere with space. My mother told me not to be dramatic. I did not slam the door. There was nothing theatrical about it. I simply walked out, and the warmth and light of that house disappeared behind us, and we went to find somewhere that actually had room for both of us. The motel was 5 blocks away. A neon sign, $30 a night, a small television bolted to the wall, and a room that smelled of industrial cleaning products, and a kind of generalized sadness that settles into places where people stay only when they have no better option. I checked in without making conversation. Ruby and I sat on the edge of one of the beds, and I looked at the crack in the ceiling above us and thought about how appropriate it was, how much it resembled the way I felt inside at that moment. Split down the middle, divided, uncertain which half was solid and which half was already falling. Ruby fell asleep almost immediately, curled on her side with her fox tucked under her chin, the way she always slept when she was exhausted past the point of worrying. I sat on the other bed, and I did not cry. I had expected to cry, had braced for it, but what came instead was something quieter and harder and more useful. A kind of cold, clear thinking that feels nothing like peace but works like it. I thought about what had just happened. I thought about who my family was and who they had always been. I thought about my daughter's face when she heard those words, and I thought about what it meant that those words had been spoken at all. Around 3 a.m, Ruby stirred and asked me in a drowsy, half-awake voice if we were going home soon. I told her soon. She drifted back to sleep. I stayed awake until the sky outside the window turned gray, listening to the trucks passing on the highway, feeling each vibration in the floor and thinking that the earth was still moving, that things were still settling, but that I was done waiting for the ground to stop before I started deciding what came next. I grew up in an ordinary-looking house with an extraordinary talent for making one child feel like a guest and another like a resident. Brittany was the firstborn, the golden one, the achiever. She was 2 years older than me and louder and blonder, and the kind of child whose mistakes were described as creative energy, whose failures were reframed as experiments, whose presence in a room expanded to fill whatever space was available. I was the other type. That was how my father sometimes described it, with the unthinking casualness of someone who does not realize they are being unkind. Brittany was the achiever. Mara was the other type, as if I were a category rather than a person. I learned to make myself small before I understood what I was doing. My bedroom was a converted laundry room, which my parents described as perfectly functional, and which I described to no one because it had not yet occurred to me that this was something worth describing. The original laundry room had been converted because I didn't need as much space. Brittany's bedroom was on the main floor, with a window that looked out onto the backyard and shelves for her trophies, and enough room for her friends to sit and talk without feeling cramped. My room was in the back of the house, accessible through a hallway that nobody else used, and Brittany's friends would sometimes cut through it on their way to the yard without knocking. I started sleeping with headphones not because I liked music particularly, but because it created a small, portable version of privacy in a space that had none. Birthdays were instructive. Brittany had parties with balloons and streamers and friends from school, the kind of birthday that gets photographed and remembered and talked about afterward. Mine were observed at the kitchen table with a store-bought cake, and the family assembled in the obligatory fashion that marked an occasion without celebrating it. Presents were practical. Brittany got perfume, new dresses, things chosen to please her. I got a coat, always a size too large so it would last longer, which was presented as sensible and which I understood, even at the age of 9 or 10, to mean that someone had thought about the cost more than the gift. I smiled and said thank you because that was what was expected of me, and because I had already, at 9 or 10, understood that my gratitude was more about managing the mood of the room than about any genuine exchange of feeling. The distinction I learned to make, early and clearly, was the difference between beloved and useful. Brittany was beloved. She was cherished, celebrated, the subject of my mother's attention in the way that a favorite painting is the subject of a room. I was useful. I cooked with my mother while Brittany studied. I scrubbed the bathroom while Brittany practiced her extracurriculars. I shoveled snow from the driveway while Brittany did whatever it was she did that qualified as too important for snow shoveling. Nobody ever said this directly. It was communicated through the 1,000 small decisions that make up a household, through who was excused from what and who was asked to do what, through whose time was considered valuable and whose was available. I absorbed this information the way children absorb everything, without analysis, filing it away in the part of myself that was already learning to be convenient. When I was 17, I received a full scholarship to a university 5 hours away, and I accepted it without hesitation, and I packed my room without crying. I remember my mother hugging me at the door and whispering that they were proud of me, and I remember the way she said it, like something she was confessing rather than celebrating, like the words carried an awareness of their own lateness. I drove away and felt, for the first time in my memory, something like the absence of weight. University was the first quiet place I had ever lived. No Brittany claiming the bathroom. No friends of hers walking through my room unannounced. No household tasks assigned on the basis of whose time was considered expendable. I chose social work as my field of study, which people sometimes found ironic and which I found entirely logical. I had grown up in a house that taught me what broken systems looked like from the inside. I understood neglect not as an abstract concept, but as a physical sensation, as the particular temperature of a room where nobody is looking at you. I understood what it did to a person to grow up believing they were the other type. I wanted to work with families that could be helped, to be the presence that somebody needed, to actually look at the children in rooms where nobody else was looking. I graduated without a visit from my parents. They mailed a card. That same summer, Brittany got married in a ceremony that my mother described to me in enthusiastic detail: the venue, the flowers, the dress, the reception. The floral centerpieces alone cost more per table than my entire month's living expenses at the time. I know this because my mother accidentally sent me a text meant for Brittany about the centerpiece budget. I laughed when I read it. Then I let myself feel the thing underneath the laughter, and then I laughed again, because sometimes that is the only response available. I spent 10 years building a life that looked, from the outside, the way a life is supposed to look. A steady job, a small house, a salary that covered my needs and allowed me to save modestly and live without anxiety. A healthy, hard-won understanding of myself and other people, including the clear-eyed recognition that family is not a guarantee of love, and that love is not a guarantee of goodness. I was fine. I was genuinely, carefully, deliberately fine. And then I met Ruby. I was assigned to her mother's case when Ruby was 2 years old. Her mother was a young woman in her mid-20s who was struggling in ways that were serious and concrete and documented. 2 DUI arrests, unstable housing, intermittent employment, a pattern of decisions that kept putting her at the edge of losing everything. I visited twice a week as required by the case, and I checked the boxes and wrote the notes and filled the reports. I was professional. I was appropriately detached. I was doing my job. Ruby ruined my professional detachment on our first meeting. She walked directly up to me, this tiny person with dark curly hair and serious, watchful eyes, and she wrapped her arms around my neck with a completeness and certainty that suggested she had decided, in approximately 3 seconds, that I was someone she could trust. Her mother watched this with something between amusement and irritation and said that Ruby liked everybody. This was not true. I figured this out within a few weeks. Ruby did not like everybody. She liked people with quiet voices and consistent behavior. She liked routine and predictability. She liked when I brought crayons, which I started doing after the second visit because she had reached for my pen with such focused desire that it seemed unkind not to bring something better. For months I visited and observed and documented and left, and every time I left, Ruby would stand at the apartment door with her purple sippy cup and watch my car until I turned the corner and disappeared. I drove away each time thinking about that small figure at the door, and each time I arrived home I noted to myself, with the professional part of my brain, that this was an attachment pattern worth monitoring. With the other part of my brain, the part that was not professional, I noted that a child watching for you from a doorway every time you leave is a child who needs more than twice weekly case visits. Then one week Ruby's mother didn't answer the door. The week after, the same. The case workers made inquiries. She had left, suddenly and completely, the way some people do when the situation becomes more than they can manage. The state took over and Ruby went to emergency foster placement, and I went home that night and could not sleep because I kept seeing a small face pressed to a window, waiting for a car that was not going to come back. I did something that social workers are not supposed to do. I volunteered to become Ruby's temporary foster placement. The paperwork was extensive, and the background checks were thorough, and the process took longer than I wanted it to. But within a month, Ruby was sleeping in the guest room of my house, in a bed with clean sheets and a night light, surrounded by the crayons I had started buying in bulk. The first night she woke up crying, and I sat on the floor beside her bed in the dark and stayed there until she fell back asleep. When I finally got up, my legs had gone numb and my lower back ached, and I stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment, listening to her breathe, and understood that I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Some doors, once you walk through them, close behind you, and you realize, standing on the other side, that you were never going back anyway. 3 months later, she called me Mama. She said it by accident, the way children absorb language and vocabulary and titles from the emotional reality of their daily lives, without planning or announcement. She just called me Mama and then looked at me with large, uncertain eyes, waiting to see what I would do. I did nothing. I did not correct her. I did not explain. I simply continued with whatever we were doing, and after a few seconds she continued too, and the words settled into the air between us and became true. The adoption process was long and bureaucratic and occasionally maddening, and completely worth every single form and court appearance and waiting room. When the judge signed the final paperwork, he said congratulations in the warm, slightly performative way that judges say things during adoption hearings, and I felt something that I can only describe as the universe correcting an error. Not a triumph, not a victory, just a settling, a righting, a thing finally being the way it was supposed to be. I called my parents that evening with the news. My mother said, "Oh, wow," and then paused in a way that communicated that she was recalibrating what this meant for her understanding of my life. My father asked whether I was sure about the responsibility of raising someone else's child on my own. My sister, Brittany, sent a text with heart emojis. That was the entirety of my family's celebration of the most significant event of my life to that point. I drove down that summer to introduce Ruby properly. I had decided, with the optimism that I now recognize as willful and slightly foolish, that becoming a parent would change how my family related to me, that a grandchild would activate something in my parents that had been dormant, that the presence of a child would soften the edges of the dynamics I had grown up inside. I wanted Ruby to have grandparents who baked cookies and told stories and attended school plays. I wanted her to have cousins who were friends and a family that extended beyond the two of us. I wanted, in other words, the thing I had never quite had myself, and I believed that wanting it hard enough might produce it. Ruby was 4 years old that summer, shy and observant, the kind of child who takes time to warm up but who, once warm, is completely and entirely present. She had brought drawings for everyone, made carefully at the kitchen table the evening before we drove down, one for each person, her interpretation of what she knew about each of them based on my descriptions. Brittany's children looked at the drawings briefly and moved on. My mother accepted the portrait Ruby made of her with a polite smile and described it as colorful. At dinner, my father asked, in a tone of genuine inquiry rather than cruelty, whether Ruby knew she was adopted, as if this were a fact she might need to be informed of rather than a reality that had been the foundation of her entire relationship with me. My mother added that it might be better to tell her early, so she wouldn't think she was really part of the family. She said it without flinching, without lowering her voice, without any apparent awareness that it was a devastating thing to say about a 4-year-old child who was sitting 3 feet away. I looked at Ruby, who was coloring a page from the activity book I had brought, not visibly listening, but present, always absorbing. I swallowed what I wanted to say, and I changed the subject, and I drove home 2 days later with Ruby asleep in her car seat, and the sentence lodged somewhere in my chest where it stayed, immovable, for a long time afterward. Later that night, I overheard my mother in the kitchen with Brittany. The words were quiet, but I caught the shape of them, the essential substance. You can't just buy love. That sentence, delivered in a whispered confidence between my mother and my sister about my daughter, told me more clearly than anything else could have about what Ruby was to them. Not a grandchild, not a niece, a transaction, a decision I had made that they had not quite approved of and were not quite sure what to do with. I kept visiting anyway. Holidays, birthdays, the usual rotation of obligatory gatherings. I told myself I was doing it for Ruby, giving her the experience of extended family, building memories that would matter later. Once Ruby asked me why Grandma only hugged her when there was a camera nearby. I told her Grandma was shy. I lied because the truth, which was that Grandma's affection was a performance for an audience rather than a genuine expression of feeling, was not something I was ready to explain to a 5-year-old. By the time Ruby turned 5, she had stopped asking to visit. Children understand what they are told even when they are told nothing. They read the temperature of rooms. They notice what is real and what is constructed. Ruby had noticed, and she had drawn her own conclusions, and her conclusions were correct. I had been thinking about all of this during the hours I spent awake in that $30 motel room with the cracked ceiling, listening to the highway outside and waiting for morning. I was not thinking about it in an emotional way, not letting myself cycle through grief or anger, but in the methodical, analytical way that I approach cases in my professional life. I was cataloging facts. I was identifying patterns. I was assessing what had actually happened versus what I had been telling myself about what was happening. The facts were these. My family had spent my entire childhood communicating, through their choices and their allocation of attention and their expressions of pride and their distribution of resources, that I was less important than my sister. They had watched me build a career and adopt a child and construct a life without meaningful engagement or celebration. They had invited me to stay with them during a housing crisis and had, upon my arrival, told me that my child could not come inside. They had said this in front of my child. They had watched her cry. They had offered no apology. They had not called the next day to check on us. The morning after the motel, I made a decision. I was not going to beg anyone for space again. We were done with that. I called Simone, who was my colleague and also, in the truest sense, my friend, the kind of friend who shows up without being asked and understands without needing explanation. I told her what had happened, and she listened without interruption, with the focused attention of someone who is taking notes even when they are not writing anything down. And when I finished, she told me to come to her house immediately. She had a spare room. Her daughter Olivia would be thrilled for the company. I should stop wherever I was and come directly. I drove 5 hours with Ruby asleep in the back seat, and when I pulled into Simone's driveway and she opened the door and her house smelled of coffee and warm food and ordinary, comfortable life, something in me released that I had been holding without realizing how tightly I was gripping it. Olivia, who was 8 and barefoot and entirely uninhibited, opened the door alongside her mother and looked at Ruby and said, "Hi, want to see my room?" And Ruby, without a moment's hesitation, nodded and walked inside and disappeared with her. Just like that. 2 children, instant. No negotiation, no assessment, no conditions about space or beds or whether there was room for one more. Just come in, you belong here, let me show you everything. Simone put a mug of tea in my hands and told me to stay as long as I needed. I sat at her kitchen table and felt the specific relief of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has finally been allowed to set it down. I already knew about the house. It was knowledge I had been carrying for years without fully examining what it meant. My grandfather, my father's father, had left me a 1/3 ownership stake in my parents' property when I was 17. He had done this quietly, without fanfare, as if he saw something in the family dynamic that needed correcting, as if he wanted to ensure that the middle child who was being treated as peripheral would have something concrete and legal and non-negotiable to call her own. I had never used this. I had never even thought of it as something to use. The house was my parents' home. They lived in it. It was family property, which meant it was sacred in the way that family things are sacred. Untouchable not because of legal restriction, but because of the emotional weight that surrounds them. I sent them $200 a month, a small contribution to maintenance and upkeep, which I had told myself was a generous gesture, and which I now recognized was a tax I had been paying for the privilege of staying in their good graces. On the second morning at Simone's house, while Ruby and Olivia drew pictures in the living room, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and my insurance paperwork, and I looked at my banking app and thought about a very simple question. If my family had determined that there was no room in their house for my daughter, then what exactly was I paying $200 a month to maintain? The question arrived fully formed, and I did not need to spend time with it. I canceled the transfer. One tap. Done. It felt, as I told Simone later, like cutting a leash I hadn't known I was wearing. The next thought arrived almost immediately and with the same clarity. A 1/3 ownership stake in a property is not a courtesy. It is not a gift that can be revoked or a privilege contingent on good behavior. It is a legal reality, documented and recorded and entirely mine. I searched for a real estate lawyer, found one with good reviews and nearby availability, and booked an appointment for the following morning. When I told Simone what I was planning, she looked at me for a moment and said 3 words: "About damn time." The lawyer was a woman named Franklin, precise and unhurried, the kind of person who has seen every variation of a family falling apart and who has long since stopped being surprised by any of it. She reviewed the deed documents and explained my options with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who is used to translating legal reality for people who have been living inside emotional confusion. She told me I was listed as a tenant in common with my parents and sister. She told me I was free to sell my share or petition for a court-ordered sale of the entire property. She told me this was perfectly legal even if my family was currently living there. She said especially if my family was currently living there, and the faintest trace of dry humor moved through her voice when she said it. I told her to move forward. She began drafting the legal notice that afternoon. I walked out of her office into the pale winter sunlight and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the sharpness of the air on my face, and felt something that I want to be careful about naming, because it was not triumph, and it was not anger, and it was not grief. It was precision. The feeling of having finally picked up the right instrument after years of trying to do the job with the wrong tools. 3 days later, the certified letter went out. Return receipt. The formal, irrefutable language of legal process. I had not warned them because warning them would have given them the opportunity to perform contrition they did not feel, and I was no longer in the business of accepting performances. Whatever came next would be real. My phone rang the following evening. My mother. I answered with my name. She began without greeting, with the breathless urgency of someone who has just received information they cannot organize. She asked what I had done. She said our home, and I noticed the pronoun and reflected it back to her, nodding its particular interest given the circumstances. In the background, I could hear Brittany's voice, identifying the cause of the problem in a way that managed to be simultaneously accurate and completely wrong. She's doing this because of that child. I said that the child had a name. My mother told me I couldn't do this to my family. I told her my family had already done this to me. My father attempted reason in the shaky, careful way of a man who is not sure of his footing. I reminded him that I had grown up invisible in that house and asked whether he remembered that part. Brittany took the phone and told me I was going to make them homeless. I explained, with the patience of someone who has explained complicated things to people who do not want to hear them many times before, that I was selling my share. What happened after that would be a consequence of their choices, not mine. There was shouting. I held the phone away from my ear and listened to it from a distance, and then I brought it back and told them they were welcome to buy me out. And when my mother asked where she was supposed to find that kind of money, I told her she might consider the savings she had accumulated from all the space she hadn't used to house my daughter. Then I ended the call. I had expected guilt. I had expected the familiar weight of being the person who caused the problem, which was the role I had been cast in for most of my life. What I felt instead was clarity of a particular electric, almost physical kind. Simone found me standing at the window and asked if they had called. I said they had screamed. She said that was progress and offered pie or wine. I said both. We ate at the kitchen table in comfortable silence while, outside, Ruby and Olivia drew chalk flowers on the driveway. and their laughter came through the window like something that had nothing to do with any of what I was carrying. The months that followed were full of the particular texture of a situation that has been set in motion and cannot be stopped. My family produced their arguments through the legal process, claiming that my 1/3 share had already been accounted for in the cost of raising me, that my childhood constituted my inheritance, that I had already received what was owed. Franklin told me it was a delay tactic. The court rejected the argument without much deliberation. Then Franklin called me with something that made my throat close. There was a mortgage on the property, a large one, taken out years earlier without my knowledge, and my name was on it. My signature was on the documents, except the signature was not mine. I knew this with the certainty that people know their own handwriting, the particular way they form letters, the specific pressure and angle and rhythm that is as individual as a fingerprint. What was on those documents was a careful imitation, practiced and neat, someone who had studied my signature long enough to reproduce its essential shape, but had not quite captured the thing underneath it, the actual person who had written it. I called Franklin back and told her. She said she had assumed as much. She told me we would need to report it. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after the call ended and tried to process what it meant that my family had forged my signature on a financial document. Not borrowed without asking. Not assumed. Forged. Deliberately, carefully, with practice, using my name and my identity as a resource to be extracted in the same way they had been extracting resources from me my entire life. The only difference was that this one had a legal name. The court hearing was 2 weeks later. 5 hours of driving to sit in a room with my mother's cold look and Brittany's performance of injured virtue and my father's study of the floor. The judge reviewed the advancement claim and dismissed it. Then Franklin introduced the mortgage and the forged signature, and the room went very still in the specific way that rooms go still when a truth that people have been carefully not saying is finally said out loud in a language that cannot be argued with. My mother's face drained of color. Brittany's mouth opened. My father's knuckles whitened on the arms of his chair. The judge said the word forgery, and something that had been clenched inside me for a very long time released. The investigation moved with the efficiency of institutions when the evidence is clear. The bank confirmed the forgery. The documents were false. Repayment of the mortgage was demanded immediately. The house that had been the source of the conflict and the symbol of all my family's particular pathologies went to a court-appointed agent and was listed for sale. I watched the real estate photographs circulate online and felt the strangeness of seeing a place you grew up in transformed into a product. The light made flattering, the rooms made neutral. Every trace of the particular life lived there smoothed away. My family's calls and messages during this period were a catalog of accusation and self-pity. Social media posts from Brittany about the cruelty of people who would evict their own parents, which generated sympathetic responses from people who did not know the story and liked the narrative of villains they could recognize from their own lives. My mother's texts, which arrived at unpredictable hours, each one a fresh delivery of blame. I answered one of them. I said 4 words. You earned all of it. Then I stopped answering entirely. The house sold. Franklin called me with the final numbers. After the mortgage repayment and the legal fees and all the costs of the process, my 1/3 came to $23,000. Clean, untouched, mine. My parents and Brittany received essentially nothing from their combined 2/3, everything consumed by the debt they had accumulated and the legal consequences they had generated. My mother sent a text. We lost everything because of you. No apology. No acknowledgement of what they had done. Just the clean, familiar weight of blame, placed on me as it had always been placed on me, with the practiced ease of people who have been doing it for a very long time. I stared at the text until the letters blurred. Then I deleted it. Simone came out with 2 cold beers and sat beside me and said I looked like someone who had survived a storm. I said I had. She said they just didn't know they were still inside it. I said that was about right. I used the $23,000 to pay off the remaining balance on my own mortgage. One transfer, and the house that Ruby and I lived in, the house with the repaired walls and the new foundation and no red sticker on the door, belonged to us completely. No debt, no landlord, no condition or obligation of any kind, just ours. Ruby helped me hang a welcome home sign on the front door the day we moved back in. She had made it herself, letters cut from colored paper and assembled with tape, slightly crooked, the way all things made by small hands are slightly crooked. She stood back and looked at it with the satisfaction of someone surveying finished work and said she thought the house felt stronger. I asked her what she meant. She considered it seriously for a moment and said maybe because we built the foundation without asking anyone's permission. She was 5 years old, and she was right. My parents and Brittany are managing. My mother and father rent a studio apartment on the edge of town. Brittany is working 2 jobs and raising her 3 children without Shane, who left when the money disappeared, because Shane had never been interested in the family so much as in the lifestyle the family represented, and when the lifestyle ended, he left too. Brittany still posts things on social media about forgiveness and resilience and the importance of family, posts that manage to describe her situation without once acknowledging her role in creating it. They blame me. They will probably always blame me. That is their right, and they are welcome to exercise it from their rental apartments, which is where my jurisdiction ends. Ruby does Aikido now, twice a week at a studio near our house. She likes it because of the balance, she told me, because it's not about force. It's about reading what's coming and moving with it instead of against it. She demonstrates the principles for me sometimes in the living room, small and serious and entirely in her body in the way that children are when they have found the thing that fits them. I watch her, and I think about how much she understands already, at 5 years old, about staying steady when the ground moves. Sometimes, when a heavy truck passes on the road outside and the vibration travels through the floor, I still flinch. My nervous system still registers it as threat, still prepares for the walls to shudder and the cupboards to scream. But the house holds. Every time, the house holds. The foundation is solid because we rebuilt it correctly, because we stopped trying to stand on something that had already cracked. I stopped asking for space in places that didn't have room for both of us, and I started building room where there was none. It turns out that is the same skill, just pointed in a different direction. We are home. The sign on the door says so, slightly crooked in my daughter's handwriting. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. So, what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? I'd genuinely love to hear your perspective in the comments.